My name is Charles Harrell with the Veterans History Project. Today is May 28th, 2005. I'm here with Colonel Lowell Gene Larue as a veteran. Please, Mr. Larue, would you please state your entire full name?
Lowell Gene Larue.
And what is your birth date?
I was born on December 31st, 1937.
And your current address?
10104 Tatiana Court in Fredericksburg, Virginia.
What war did you serve in?
In the Vietnam War.
And where were you born?
I was born in Omaha, Nebraska.
Your branch of service during Vietnam?
U.S. Army.
And what was your rank when you went into the Army?
I started in the National Guard as a private.
And what was your rank when you finally were discharged?
I was discharged as a full colonel.
And could you state where you served?
During my entire career.
During your wartime in Vietnam?
In the wartime environment, I was in the southern end of the Republic of Vietnam in a place called Bac Lieu Province.
Colonel Larue.
It's also known as Vinh Loi Province, depending upon which map you look at.
I want you to try to remember back to your early childhood, your first memories, if you can, of growing up during World War II. Can you recall anything that you did during World War II to help the war effort?
I remember that my mother used to save tinfoil. I can remember standing in line with her to get, to buy things like when she needed nylon stockings or something like that. I do remember little things like your toothpaste tubes were made out of metal in those days, and you had to save them and turn them in order to get a new one. I remember, I think it was VE Day when we went downtown and the crowds were all over the place.
Were you in Omaha still?
No, we lived in Lincoln at that time when I was just born in Omaha, and most of my life lived in Lincoln until I left home.
During VE Day, on that day, try to visualize, if you could, what you saw during that.
Well, I was a pretty small child. My mother used to dress me. I had a sailor outfit and I had an Army outfit, and I suspect that day we were in the Army outfit, and it had a Sam Graham belt and the whole business, and all I remember was a lot of crowds. We went downtown because everybody was downtown on the street.
How did you get downtown?
Probably at that time, probably on a bus. I don't remember, but probably on a bus.
What's your mother like? What was her name?
Her name was Esther. Maiden name was Bensinger. She grew up on a farm in southeast Nebraska.
Did you visit that farm often?
A little bit when I was very, very young. My grandfather was still alive, and he lived on the farm.
Do you recall your granddaddy?
Hard. He died when I was about 8. But I can visualize him a little bit. And one or two little things from the farm I can sometimes remember.
How about your dad?
My dad was a hard-working fellow. Had various jobs when I was growing up. When I was very small, he worked in a cement plant in Louisville, Nebraska. Until I was 4, I think we moved to Lincoln. And eventually he ended up working for Goodyear, from which he retired. He had been drafted and was actually 2 weeks from going into the service when he got a call and said, "Go find a job in the defense industry." The law changed. His age and number of children exempted him from the draft. So he got on with Goodyear, and then after the war, Goodyear decided to move to Lincoln, and he stayed with them.
So he was working for Goodyear during the war?
Yeah, at the end of the war, toward the last 2 or 3 years. Yeah.
What's his name?
His name was William B. Larue, and he was a junior.
Did you know your grandfather on that side?
Yes, that grandfather was William B. Sr. He was a railroad man, section foreman on the railroad, I think, Missouri Pacific, and before that, Union Pacific. But
in Nebraska?
Mm-hmm. Southeast Nebraska, basically.
Was he old enough to be in the First War?
Probably too old for the First War. His father was in the Civil War, but was one of those people who, one of the many casualties of disease, and wasn't in very long, and he was discharged because of illness. And but we do go back a long ways, and my fifth removed grandfather was a soldier in the Revolutionary War. So.
Was your family of pioneer stock, first out there in Nebraska?
No. My specific family was in. It drifted west from over time. I guess they came into New Jersey, New York at first, and drifted west. Probably after, as near as I can tell, after the Revolutionary War, they probably moved because of land grants and things, and ended up in Indiana, which is where my great-grandfather was born. And then he moved to Illinois. They were all, or to Iowa, and they were mostly farmers, and were moving where the land was.
Before the Civil War?
Yeah. Well, before and after,
actually.
And I think my grandfather was the first one that was not a farmer. He ended up with the railroad.
Were you the first of the children?
Of my family, yes.
How many
Three
brothers
of
and
us.
sisters you have?
Another brother, who's number 2, and a sister.
Were they all close together?
Well, we're 4 years apart. Each
4
of
years.
us. 8 years from me to my sister.
Was your parents older when they had you?
Yeah, my mother was. My mother was in her 30s. By the time she had her fourth child, she was 40 something. My dad was a few years younger than my mother.
Did they marry late?
I guess, for the times, probably. Yeah, probably around 30. And I think she was 30-something. He was probably 28 or so. And for the times, that's fairly late.
Did your parents ever talk about how they struggled through the Great Depression?
Oh, yeah. They, now, my mother grew up on a farm, and my grandfather was a very prosperous farmer, so she really was in pretty good shape. My father quit school because the family needed the extra money, basically went to work. He and his sister shared an apartment. The sister was a school teacher, and he was, which was paid very little in those days, one-room schoolhouse. And he was taking laborer jobs wherever he could find them, building roads and that kind of thing. And it was tough, but on the other hand, they seem to have done okay. Perhaps because of my grandfather, I don't know.
Did your dad ever have to work for the government in one of the government programs?
No. He always found something to do.
What did your dad hope to ever be? Did he have a career objective?
Oh yeah, they both had much bigger visions than they were ever able to handle. My mother was trapped in an era where women went to maybe 10th grade, and that was it. That was considered sufficient. Like I said, he dropped out primarily because of the Depression. But they both always wanted to be in the medical profession, but neither one of them ever got there. Neither ever got back to school or anything. So we found that I can never remember that my brother and I and sister were ever maybe going to college. It was always when you go to college. I believe we moved to Lincoln because it was the college town for Nebraska, and it was the odds of us going to school if we could stay at home were much better. So I think that's why they moved there in the first place.
So your dad placed high expectations
Both
on
of them
school?
placed high expectations on education. Yeah.
Were they able to put all three of you through school?
Yeah, we all three. Well, my sister had a couple of years, but my brother and I were the first in our family to graduate from college.
As World War went on, you mentioned your dad was on the way to being drafted when he got war work with the tire company. The war ends in September 45. You're still a young 7, 8, 9 year old
I'm still
kid.
a little kid.
Do you recall the life after the war versus life during the war?
I'm not sure that it was that different for me personally. There was a period of a year or so my dad was out of work because the Goodyear plant shut down at the end of the war. And then they decided that they liked the workers in Nebraska, so they opened the plant on a permanent basis. And it's still there, and it's one of the biggest in the world for what it does.
So during the war, he was still in Nebraska working at a temp
Oh, yeah,
plant?
he worked there the whole time. And then after that period of he was working on farms basically after the war as a hired hand until the plant reopened and he went back there. I found that actually the immediate 2 or 3 years after the war were probably a prosperous time. And in talking to my dad, I'm an historian and I did an oral history with him when I was working on a master's degree. And he said it was prosperous because there wasn't anything to spend money on during the war. And so they saved. And after the war, they had plenty of money to, at least in their minds, to spend on things.
So the year that
they
he was
considered
out of work.
that, yeah, it wasn't a hardship time. And they considered it to be a prosperous several years right after the war because of that. So.
Did any of your cousins or friends, older friends, go to war in World War II?
Yeah, my mother's oldest sister, her oldest son was a Navy flyer.
Who was he?
His name was Neiman. Let me think of his first name. I'll have to come back to that. But he was a Navy flyer, and then the youngest son, who I do know, is Lloyd Neiman, was placed in the Merchant Marine Academy, and spent some time on ships right at the very, very tail end of the war, and then was a merchant mariner for some years before he quit that and went back to school and became an engineer.
As you were growing up during
yeah, that's all during World War II. Oh, well, my uncle. I had one uncle, Hubert Larue, who was my dad's youngest brother, was in the Army in World War II and fought through the island campaigns in the Pacific. Started out as a private and came out as a captain.
During your young youth, I guess, before 1950, when you were growing up in elementary school and so on, did you look up toward anybody as a model figure?
I guess in that time frame it was probably my father, just as, he was the closest person.
Did you have...
In the 50s, when I got into high school, I guess I'd have to say there were a couple of coaches who were, models, if you will. They're the guys that, outside of the family, that provided a certain amount of discipline, and I could see them. I was a pretty good kid. I didn't get in too much trouble, but we had some interesting kids, and some of them I saw change because of our coaches. And I always, especially this one basketball coach, I held in deep esteem forever. His name was Ed Johnson.
What did he do?
What did he do?
That made you so esteemed?
Just the way he handled kids who wanted to get on the edge of being bad or doing things they shouldn't. He managed to always pull them back, and using athletics. These were good athletes, and if you wanted to play for him, you better be a good person too. And just his way of handling things.
Were you totally physically fit as a teenager?
Yeah, pretty good.
Were you a big sports person?
No, I played some pretty decent football and ran a little track, but
with the school?
I was no outstanding high school athlete, but I did okay, especially in football. But I ran with the athletic crowd most of the time.
Did you have any pets that you were real close to?
Not really. We had a dog here and a dog there, but nothing special as a kid.
The 1940s.
Did have a pony though.
Did you have a pony?
As a small, let's see, I was probably 8 and my brother was 4 or so, and we kept the pony on my cousin. My dad's cousin lived close to Lincoln, and we kept the pony on his farm for a year or so.
Why?
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 I really don't know. We wanted a pony, and my dad had an opportunity and got hold of one and a tack for a real good price, and he thought it was something that was good for us. So, we'd go. There are pictures somewhere. I can't find them right now, but there are pictures of us riding that pony in a snowstorm and in the summertime. I used to live on that farm in the summertime with my dad's cousin for about I think 4 summers I lived out there. That was interesting. That was from the time when we started out with horses, ended up with tractors.
Were you working for money on the farm?
Nah, just actually for health, and just stayed there and did my share of little chores and stuff.
Was it close enough to go back home?
Oh yeah,
weekends or something?
5 or 6 miles, just on the edge of Lincoln.
Who was your best friend in middle school and high school?
High school? Well, I had a bunch. I guess one of my best friends was a guy named Don Wenzel, who unfortunately we lost in his 30s with liver cancer. We had reconnected when I was in the military. He happened to be living in Colorado Springs when I was stationed there, and we reconnected as played bridge with him a lot. And
what did you and him?
2 years later, we lost him.
What did you do with him as a
played ball? Yeah, primarily we were ball players. There were groups of us that were together at various times. And that was a group shifted depending on what was going on and how old we were. We more or less ran in groups rather than as individuals. Best friends. I had a lot of close friends, but at different times, different people and different groups, really.
If you had to characterize yourself as a young man before graduation, what word would you use?
School?
From high school.
What was my what?
What word would you use?
Probably more oriented toward academics than the average. And that was instilled in me by my parents. Do well in school. That was important.
How about social?
Fun loving.
Fun loving?
Yeah. We from junior high school, we had a large group of boys and girls who we used to get together on weekends. We had parents that were willing to chaperone dances and things. And there was I guess it was an old schoolhouse that was used as a community center. And parents were willing to chaperone those things. And it was, when everybody walked there and they walked home, group of guys, group of gals, got together for a few hours and then went our separate ways.
Socially, were you very...
So those things, we were a very socially active group, or at my age group for some reason, and we're from junior high school all the way through high school.
Do you recall the day of graduation from high school?
Oh, yeah, I think so. It was the good old days when we had a baccalaureate. It was a moving event. It was interesting and important. And, I was in the choir and we sang at that. At graduation we sang. I remember that it was especially Well, we all us tough guys who couldn't get emotional at I had graduation, but I know that it was an emotional event when we sang at the high school graduation, and it was important to all of us to graduate.
I know you retired as an educator. Could you compare your graduation with the graduations of the 1990s?
That's interesting. Much smaller group, that's for sure. Much smaller schools then. I think there were probably 250 in my graduating class, and now you see some, not necessarily in this county, but in some counties. My son was in a graduating class with nearly 1,000 up in Northern Virginia. So smaller schools.
Do you think it's
more formal?
More formal today?
No, then.
Yeah.
In some ways, more formal. You kind of get a little bit of a, excuse me, athletic event. You know, somebody crosses the stage and you get all this cheering thing nowadays. It's much more quiet, much more formal. You might get something like that, but very, very rarely. It was more of a solemn occasion in some ways. No, I don't. Not that I would pass judgment whether that's good or bad. It just was.
What did you do after graduation?
Well, I went to the University of Nebraska that fall on a scholarship, which I promptly lost. But
how'd that happen?
I just wasn't paying attention. I spent more time with the fraternity than I did academically, I guess.
What was the scholarship for?
The University of Nebraska has a thing called, at that time had a thing called Regents Scholarships. Everybody in the state took a written exam. Each school had 2, I believe, scholarships. Every school in the state had 2 scholarships. A great deal of the small towns, the kids didn't go to college because they stayed on a farm or whatever. And so there were always additional ones available. And anybody that had an alternate in one of the big schools in Lincoln or Omaha almost always got a scholarship. And I was one of the alternates. And very quickly, all the alternates in my school got scholarships. In those days, they paid $50 a semester, and I think tuition was $75. So,
what year did you graduate high school?
1956.
During the Korean War, did you participate in any way with Korean War?
Only in that I had a cousin, Yvonne Holcher, who was my mother's youngest sister. My mother was the youngest of 3 girls, and the middle sister's older son had been in the Army, drafted, and did his 2 years and came out, was recalled for Korea. So we all followed the progress of the Korean War and where he was, and he was in some of the worst fighting. Believe he was in some of the Army units that were involved in some of the retreat after they were beaten back when the Chinese came in and pushed them back south.
Did you ever write him?
I didn't. No. I'm sure my mother did.
Do you recall getting any mail from him, or as a family getting mail?
No, I don't. But my mother may have, and I know that my aunt and uncle kept a Korea map, probably a National Geographic map, in their house, where my uncle kept track of on a daily basis of the front lines and where he thought his son was and that kind of thing.
How about life in the home front for you during the Korean War? Could you remember that?
I really don't remember that there was any change, to be truthful. Other than we had a relative that was in the war. I remember when, I believe it was just before he left, that we went to, actually had a girlfriend in Lincoln, and with my parents, we went to visit him was the last time we saw him before he went. Other than that, it really didn't have much effect. My dad was still working for Goodyear, so
When
not much.
when you were in high school and then you graduated, was there anything you wanted to be? Any dream?
Oh, at that time, I thought, this was, you gotta remember, this is the era of Sputnik and all this stuff, and so it was be an engineer. Everybody wanted to be an engineer. And so I thought I wanted to be an engineer. And my dad's particular job, he had some contact with fairly influential people in the Goodyear hierarchy. I had been given an autographed book written by one of the executives of Goodyear, and was an engineer and all this. So that was the thing I thought I wanted to do. Really, mathematically, wasn't cut out for it. And that's the main problem I had in my first year of college. Trying to bite off more than I really was ready to chew.
While you were in college, what did you find out you were really good at?
Really good at writing, and really interested in history. Not too bad at language.
Do you recall any term papers you did in college on history?
Yeah, I did. Well, not term papers, but I had to take a couple of courses that were the third hour of a three-hour credit was a paper. One of those was on the German General Staff. Military history was one of my things, and don't recall. Oh, the other one was on the Pearl Harbor situation. At that time, there was still great swirl and many books being published on controversy over whether Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor and whether the general and the admiral had really messed up or had not messed up, or had just been uninformed, and so there was. There were a lot of things being published, and I did a paper on some of that stuff too.
When you were in college, you wrote the paper on Pearl, and now as a retired historian, do you think your mind has changed from the 1950s when you did your paper versus now?
Oh, you mean on that subject?
Yes.
Well, probably so. I don't really remember what I wrote then.
Okay.
I do remember the General Staff one, and that was had to do with the naivety of allowing the General Staff to continue post-World War I, even though the rest of the world thought they had so to speak, cut the head off the Nazi or the German juggernaut. They actually, by allowing the General Staff to continue, they had complete continuity, and were able to build this, the 100,000-man army. And from that, as you all know, from that, they're a huge army. It just seemed, in retrospect, it seemed awfully naive to let them have that central authority still there, even though they deactivated most of the military.
Do you still have these papers?
No, not those. I've got a couple I wrote as masters. I was doing a master's, but nothing there.
So here you are in college, a young man. Had you traveled much before?
No, not really. A little bit around the Midwest, because from junior high school I'd been in the National Guard, so that gave me a certain amount of independence. I started in May of 1955 when I was a junior. So turned 17 and a half, I joined the National Guard. And I'll be truthful, that was the thing people did in those days to ensure they didn't get drafted out of college. You joined the Guard, you did your 7 years, you didn't get drafted out of college. That was why most people, a great many people that I went to high school, joined the Guard or the Navy Reserve or something, and for that very reason. And they'd go to college. The interesting thing is a great many of those I joined with were either a year older or my age, ended up staying in the National Guard, getting commissions, and having that as a second profession. and there were several of us that ended up in active duty. Basically, I liked it. That's how I ended up staying in. But so we moved around a little bit in that. We went to, I think it was the second year I was in, which would have been the summer before I went to college. Is we went to Fort Knox, Kentucky on a troop train, which you don't find anymore. And that was a big adventure.
Tell me about a troop train versus why we don't have them anymore.
Well, troop trains were extensively used in World War II in Korea, and you just don't have the passenger train network you have then. When I was a youngster, you could go almost anywhere on a train. And like I said, my grandfather was a railroad man, so traveling on trains was not something unusual for us. But on that particular, we went to Fort Knox, Kentucky, trained there for a couple of weeks, and came back on a troop train. A troop train, you have regular cars where you sit. They're not Pullmans. You don't have nice sleeping quarters. It's kind of a boring thing, actually, driving on a troop train. And then when it's time to eat, you walk back. No, it's all soldiers. When it's time to eat, you walk back through, and you have what amounts to a boxcar, except it doesn't look like the ordinary boxcar, in which a regular mess situation set up, a field mess. And that's how you eat. It's GI food in what amounts to a boxcar, although it's slightly nicer than that. And you go a car at a time, go back to eat, go back to where you're sitting. It was a very interesting experience for me, for a young guy. We had done some traveling with my family in Colorado, for example, and we had taken a train trip, as a matter of fact, when I was still at home, into to Denver to visit friends one time in the wintertime. It was a very interesting trip, train trip in the winter. We had taken a driving trip to Colorado.
On that train trip in the winter, were there heating cars?
Oh yeah. That was a regular passenger train.
Still steam, or was it diesel?
I don't remember that. Right. Don't remember that. Just remember doing it.
There at Fort Knox, that first real training exercise with a guard, can you recall what you did?
Oh yeah, we spent a lot of time on the firing range. That was the main reason we went, was because at Knox you could fire the big guns. They had the proper ranges for that. They had we had driving course. That was Fort Knox was the training center for armor, and we were a headquarters company, a reconnaissance platoon of a headquarters company of a tank battalion, and the whole tank battalion went there, and those who had not been qualified to drive were trained in how to drive tanks. And
do you recall the name of that unit? Nebraska National Guard?
Yeah, it was the Nebraska National Guard. I can't remember the tank battalion number.
What was your job with that first summer?
Well, at that time I was part of the scout section. We had a scout section, an infantry squad, a mortar squad, and tanks. Actually, I was part of the tank section then, I guess. Probably a loader or a driver in the tank. And I did every job in that platoon except I was never on the mortar squad. And when I finally left the National Guard, which was really because I got commissioned, I was in that unit I became the scout section leader, which was about 10 or 12 people, two sections, two squads. And we were the scouts. And then there was a reorganization, and we became the headquarters company of an infantry battle group. And our platoon became a communications platoon. I ended up being the wire foreman of that. So, interesting background in the military. I had training as a tanker, training as an infantryman, and as a scout, and then as a communicator.
Were you still driving old Sherman tanks?
No, we were. We had the M41, which was a light tank that was used for reconnaissance primarily, and then we also trained on the M47, which was a medium tank of a 90 millimeter weapon. M41 had a 76 millimeter weapon. We trained in both because we were the recon platoon. When we were in the tank battalion, they expected that if we were ever activated, that our recon platoon would be broken up as cadre, and we'd be immediately get 1 or 2 rank promotion and become cadre for the tank companies, because we had some of the better training, and it was an interesting unit. A bunch of young high school kids, and our NCOs were battle-proven people from World War II and Korea. When I first went in, the scout section chief had been a scout section leader in the Italian campaign in World War II. The mortar section chief had been a mortarman in Korea. We had a scout who was a Norwegian, who had been in Norwegian underground World War II, lived in a tree for 2 weeks spying on the Germans. He was getting his citizenship by being in the National Guard.
You're mentioning all these folks. They shared their stories with you?
Some, not all. Just they shared their experience. They were experienced in what they did, and so they were excellent trainers. And we had a kid who had been a sniper in Korea, and so we had people who had had been in combat, who were the cadre or the NCOs, and some of them were privates in the ranks, but these were people with real experience, and they're the ones that trained us. So that group of young high school kids that I was in the Guard with, and many of whom stayed in the Guard, some of us went in the regular Army, had a core of training that came from experienced World War II and Korean veterans.
When you were in the Guard, was there any NCO that you looked up to as a real hero figure?
The one that, when I was in the Scouts, and this guy, I can't remember his name, but he was a Scout section chief who had been through the World War II campaign in Italy as a Scout section chief. Very, very, in a way, kind of a fatherly figure, because he was older than us by quite a bit. But he had, we were in awe of him because he was a real World War II veteran, and then he was very bright in things military, and was able to teach us a lot.
Did you?
We listened when he talked, because we knew he knew what he was talking about.
Did you shoot rifles?
Well, lots of different things. Scouts would carry carbines. Tanks, you carried your sidearm was a pistol or the old submachine gun they call a grease gun, 45 caliber submachine gun. And one rifles in the rifle squad. So you had to qualify on all those things.
Were these things the most modern type of things
at that time?
At that time,
yeah. And we had to qualify on all of those plus the tank.
So you didn't feel like you were given second-class equipment at that time in the military?
No, we had good equipment. Now, we had second-tier tanks. The Army was into the M48 tank by then. We had the tank battalion had 47s, and the recon had 41s. And I don't know what they were using recon. They weren't using 41s then. But they weren't, it wasn't World War II era tanks. Yeah, they were in good mechanical shape.
How long did you serve in the National Guard?
I was actually in the Guard for 6 years, which was 2 3-year tours.
Do you recall any other training exercises that stick out in your mind?
Well, every summer except the one, we went to Camp Ripley in Minnesota, and so everything was, it just depended. The very first year I went there, that was basically my recruit training. They spent a lot of time teaching basics, and we spent the first week, I think, just all day, every day, and learning, basic soldiering skills. And then second summer was, if I remember right, was the one we went to Fort Knox. And after that, I'd started to work myself into leadership positions, so I did different things. And I moved fairly quickly in leadership positions and became one of the prime instructors teaching classes.
Were you still a private at the time?
No, but that was as a specialist and then as a sergeant. By the time the third year was over, I think I was a Sergeant E. I was probably a specialist then. I was an Sergeant E6 when I left. And if I'd have stayed in, I would have made E7 the next year. Did
you have any friends that you went into the Guard with and stayed with?
Quite a few I went in with. Some stayed, some didn't. Some stayed, some. There were several out of my high school class that went in. Some stayed, some didn't.
Was it a close
There were people from the class ahead of mine, quite a few. Probably what influenced me to go. I knew all these guys that were a year older than me that were in there. And a lot of, at least 3 of them I can think of, or 2 of them for sure, became officers. The Nebraska National Guard started an officer candidate school. I know at least 2 of them went through that.
And you did too?
No.
How did you get your commission?
I went through ROTC at the University of Nebraska. I had, like I said, I worked my way into leadership positions. I was kind of one of the primary instructors. Whenever they had Inspector General inspection, once a year, I was the guy that instructed. I always had the class. I don't know why, but I became the guy that did the classes. And they always had a drill and ceremony thing, and I was always the guy that was the drill instructor, the guy calling the drill. So I'd get done with that and run up and make sure my classroom was ready and teach the class. And that was, that was a big part of you had an inspection, in-ranks inspection. You had this drill and ceremony thing, and you had the class, and then they were inspecting all the paperwork. And those were the 4 major parts of the annual Inspector General inspection. I had 2 of them were mine as a 19-year-old. So, and then I ended up being the NCOIC of an honor guard for the inauguration of one of the governors. They decided to put together a National Guard honor guard, and I got drafted into being the NCO in charge of that. I had to train all the people, get them dressed nicely. And somewhere, I can't find it right now, but somewhere I have a picture of that particular group. And then we were an honor guard for actually it was the inaugural ball for one of the governors. I don't remember who the governor was at the time. And then I at that time, you could be in National Guard and be in ROTC at the same time. That has changed back and forth over time. Sometimes it's true, and at other times they changed the law. And if you went into the ROTC program, you had to leave the Guard. The Guard, you were being paid for drill, for actual work. And the ROTC, you were being paid at that time for what they called subsistence, which is food. And which wasn't a whole lot of money either, but so you could do both. So there were different kinds of pay, therefore you could be in both. When I was in, I stayed in until the end of my second tour, and I spent 5.5 years getting out of college. So I ended up with 6 years in the Guard and a year in standby reserves, and then got commissioned out of the University of Nebraska.
Did you find you liked being leadership?
Well, that's why I got ROTC because I liked what I was doing. I said, well, if I'm going to do this, I'd rather do it as an officer than as an enlisted man if I'm going to go active duty. So,
What did your parents think? I realized you were an adult by that time.
well, it's interesting. They always thought my dad, you know, they're very much influenced by the Depression. So he always thought I was wasting my time. I could have had a good job instead of going off for 2 weeks in the summer and breaking it up and not being able to get good, solid jobs in the summertime. And it was several years before he understood later that 7 years or 6.5 years I spent in the National Guard, because the military pays based on longevity. It was worth a huge amount of money to me over time because I was always at the top of the pay scale on every rank once I became commissioned. And so whenever I was promoted, I went from the top pay scale of one rank to the top pay scale of another, which meant a bigger raise. When I went in, I mean, we were being paid the grand, as a second lieutenant, the pay was $220, $250 a month, grand scale. I made $314 because of this. That $90 was a huge amount of money. This is in 1962. That was a lot of money in 1962. It meant I had a brand new car and it wasn't strapping us. We weren't rich, but we didn't, you know, we were okay. And that $92 was a big amount of money in those days.
You mentioned we.
My wife and I. We were married very young, yeah. We were married. I was still in college. She worked and I finished up. And I was 20 and she was 18.
How'd you meet her?
I don't know if she wants me to record this or not. A friend of mine and I had a third friend who we were trying to rehabilitate. It's a good word. So we wanted him to date, and the other friend knew Wanda, and so we fixed him up with her. And we used to triple date, double date a lot. And at the time I was going to save this other girl, and finally that didn't work out, broke it up. And the same night she told this other guy, don't bother to call me to come back anymore. And she canceled the date with him. He was all upset about this. And so a few days later I said, look, I'll take care of this for you. So I called her up. I was going over to be the go-between to smooth all this over. And as she put it, I wasted 2 hours in the cold talking to her and trying to talk her into going out with this guy. And when I finally realized that wasn't going to happen. I said, well, if you want to go out with him, how about me? She said, why didn't you ask me 2 hours ago? It's cold. And so we started dating, and by April we were engaged, and in August we got married. And that was 47 years ago.
And she was in school too at the time?
She had gone to, she's a year behind me in high school, and she had gone to business school. And so she was working, she went to work in a bank. She had just finished the business school. She went to work at a bank. And,
did she have any concerns, as far as you know, about you being in the military?
Well, that was part of the deal up front. I said, you're going to have to remember that I'm going to go in the military. And I think I told her she had to learn to play bridge. And those were the two conditions. She agreed to them. So the big concerns came later. And we got over those too.
In 1962, you had graduated college?
Yeah, I graduated in mid-year.
You were in college when JFK was elected,
elected, but I was in the military when he was assassinated. Yeah.
When he was elected, did you have any euphoria about a new president over the old Eisenhower?
To be quite truthful, I don't think I was paying any attention.
And then
it became more important to me after I became active duty. Then you start watching politics a lot more. But,
when he was killed, you were a
I can
lieutenant.
tell you exactly when I was.
Where were you?
Well, our first assignment was in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in one of the old Nike Hercules battalions, which were scattered all over the country as defense against Soviet aircraft. And I was in we were in Mineral Wells, Texas, a little place called Fort Walters, which was eventually became the Army primary helicopter school during the Vietnam War, but at that time was a very small post, had some helicopter operations, had an engineer unit there, intelligence unit, and it had the Nike battery. And there were 4 of these scattered around the Dallas area, 4 Nike batteries. And we were there, and I was platoon leader, and then the day Kennedy was killed, I was the executive officer. And I know exactly what I was doing. I can picture it now. I was sitting at it was a high desk. You sat on a stool type thing. I was sitting there working on classified documents, because that's what executive officers did. We had a lot of classified documents, and I was working on those when the word came down that he'd been assassinated. And we knew he was in Dallas, but and almost immediately the unit was called to a high state of alert. It stayed that way for a couple of weeks because they didn't know what was going on. There was some thought that there was an invasion coming from Cuba. A bunch of air defense units were moved from Fort Bliss, Texas to southern Florida and stayed there for 15, 20 years. And we were, as the executive officer, I was also the property officer, so very quickly after they figured out what had happened, they thought it was a military carbine that was used. And so that's what we had for individual weapons, and I had to go out and make an individual count of every weapon by serial number, and then go to the ammunition point and count every bullet to be sure there was nothing missing, and make a report. And you had very little time to do this, but it was like, you only have this much time, but you must be absolutely sure every weapon's there and every bullet's accounted for. So that's what I spent my time doing. And then for the next couple of weeks, I spent a great deal of time in the unit as we were on a 24-hour alert. As we rotated through the officer duties on weapon and the battery.
During those first years of the Kennedy administration, we got involved in Vietnam. Did you have any concern or desire?
Not really at first. The first time I heard about Vietnam was an individual who was one of the operations officers. He was a captain at that time. Got the word he was leaving. And we knew he was leaving because our battery commander was going to replace him, going to the battalion to replace him. And he was going someplace called Vietnam. And the reason he was going, that he said he was going, is because if you're going to be a soldier, you had to be where the fighting was. Okay, fine. And off he went. And eventually some pictures came back of him and his gear in Vietnam. And at that stage, that's about all anybody paid attention to. Except that before I left there, the helicopter school started building up, started getting bigger and bigger. All of a sudden, they opened up an old skeet range because in order to learn lead for a helicopter gunner, the pilots were taught to shoot skeet. So there's this old skeet range at the bottom of the hill that was reactivated and cleaned up, and they were using it. And then they had a thing called Tiger Flight, which were the old Bell helicopters with machine guns strapped to the skids, which were the first armed helicopters that went into Vietnam. And these guys were trained there and did cross-country flights and things from there. And then they started to build what they called stage fields, which were small landing fields out all over the area. When I first got there was a field, landing field, and there was a municipal airport they used. That was it. Eventually, they had 7 or 8 stage fields and 3 main fields in various areas around Fort Walters. But that had started to build up before I left.
Were you flying in these helicopters?
No, not really, not then. I was supposed to be a pilot. I had taken flight when I was in ROTC. And I had applied for it and not gotten. I even applied and said, look, in that time frame, officers took both fixed wing and helicopter. And I said, look, I'll do the helicopter first because I'm here, which saves you per diem. You don't have to pay me extra for being, temporary duty. And I'll do helicopter first and then go to fixed wing school. And for some reason, the Army decided they didn't want me to fly. So I finally said, heck with it. And a great reader of regulations, and the regulations at that time said, if you applied and a certain amount of time went by, then you didn't owe them an obligation anymore for having taken the flight program. So I finally said, this is crazy. I applied twice. They don't want me. So I'll do something else. And then I was reassigned to Korea. Korea.
What did you want to be then? I
wanted to be a pilot.
Okay. After that?
I said, hey, they don't want me. I'll just be an air defense artillery. I'll just be an officer doing something else. So,
and then they sent you to Korea?
I was sent to Korea,
and when did you get to Korea?
That would have been in May of '64.
You had heard about Korea before because of the war.
Oh, yeah.
But not so much about Vietnam, even though the French had fought.
Well, the Vietnam story, the only thing I really knew about it was when the helicopter thing started building up there. Then we started getting information about it. We knew more about what was going on and paying more attention to it. It was kind of a special forces war as far as we were concerned at the beginning. Basically special forces were invented under Kennedy, and so that's what we considered to be a special forces war at the beginning.
Well,
not too concerned about it.
You arrived in Korea in May of '64. How long did you stay?
A year.
A year? What did you do there?
Same thing. Nike battalion. I was in the Inchon area.
What is a Nike battalion?
Nike's an air defense missile. Pretty good size one, nuclear capable. There were 100 and some batteries of Nikes throughout the United States for some time in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Did you ever launch one?
Well, I fired them as, in practice, you shot them down in New Mexico.
Did you ever shoot one in anger?
No. Tried to. They wouldn't let me.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in Korea, North Koreans used to test often the situation. And they would, one day, I'm sitting there and they flew a flight of 4 south of the DMZ. And that was pop-up criteria to shoot. Of course, you didn't just do it and ask permission to shoot. They were definitely identified as bad guys. Flew south of me, and they would not allow us to shoot them. There were 2 or 3 units that locked on them. We were ready to shoot, and they wouldn't allow us to shoot. Finally, we're chased out to sea by South Korean, I don't know, F-86s or whatever they were flying at the time. Interestingly, the bad guy had disappeared off the scope. So I don't know to this day whether they were shot down or not.
Did you actually see them fly by, or just radar?
No, radar. Saw them fly by, saw them turn, go out to sea. Saw them being chased. I think it was 2 of them, and there were 4 South Korean planes chasing them. And the 2 North Korean planes disappeared. And I have no idea what happened to them.
Who was in your unit?
I suspect what happened to them.
Who was in your unit there during that day? Do you recall any of the people?
Well, the battery commander was a guy named Johnson, Stan Johnson. Some of the warrant officers, a guy named Como, a guy named I can't remember them all. It's been a couple of years. I'm getting bad on names now. But.
We need to pause the tape here.
Okay.
What else happened in Korea for you?
Well, during the Tonkin Gulf incident, which really got Vietnam going, that's when I really learned something was happening in Vietnam. And we were on a very high state of alert for some time after that. Not allowed to leave our site. Radars up constantly. We had planes with side-looking radar along the border, because they weren't sure about what the North Vietnamese weren't going to do something silly too at the time.
You were flying from Korea down there?
No, we had military planes flying the DMZ, the border between North and South Vietnam, or South Korea.
Correct.
And we would track them at night. Track 3 times a day. There were these missions to track those planes to be sure they didn't drift into North Korea. We were a little concerned that the North Koreans were going to pull something after this Tonkin Gulf thing had started. And so I think it was 60 or 90 days. We were on extremely high alert, doing 3 or 4 of these tracking missions every day. We were the furthest north Nike battery, so we could track planes along the DMZ.
Was this battery, when it was set up, was it spread out over a mile or so, or was it just on one hill?
The fire control with all the radars and things were on one hill, okay, and the missiles had to be further away. I can't remember the exact distance between, but it's like up to about a mile, and they were down toward the beach, and we were on the edge of what city of Inchon was very close. We were actually outside of Inchon. But they were down toward the beach below us.
And where was your position?
I was the XO. The administrative area was like on the side of the mountain where we lived. And as executive officer, I spent most of my time in the administrative area. But all of us took turns in the radar area as what they called the battery control officer, the guy ready to shoot if you needed to. So we were doing at least 3 of these tracking missions a day, so I did several of those.
How many missiles were in your battery?
Well, you had 12 launchers, I'll put it that way. And each of those could hold one. So.
And after them 12 were shot,
well, it depends on where you were. Depends on where you were, whether you had extras or not.
I see.
But what kind?
How did you live there in Incheon, on the side of the mountain?
Well, these were old Quonset huts, actually. And one of them was set up as a VOQ. And then there was a separate little building that had been built that was like a Quonset, like a T. A Quonset, 2 pretty long Quonset. And then this building that was built beside it, which held was really the bathroom. Had probably 6 gang shower and 3 or 4 sinks, and that kind of thing. And so that was our main place. And then beside it was a Quonset that was the headquarters, where the offices were, and a Quonset that was the supply room, and then scattered up the hill were other Quonsets where the troops lived. So it was in 1964-65, and all of Korea was not real modern like it is today. I've been back in later jobs, and significant and almost unbelievable transition of the country from when I was there.
Obviously, you all had power in 64-65, right? Electricity?
Yeah.
How about the rest of the area?
Yeah, they did. Well, some. We used generators. We had our own electrical power generators which were our normal power, and then we had military generators, which were the backup power with radars and for the launcher. But for the administrative area and really everything, in normal situation, we had commercial type generators and we had Filipino contractors that ran that infrastructure stuff for us. But potable water was trucked in daily. We had like a water tower, and all day long, little water trucks came in and to fill that water tower. So water was something that you wasn't exactly rationed, but you didn't waste any of it.
Did you have your own room as a place to stay?
Yeah, within the Quonset, that was divided into rooms.
Did you get to visit the towns very often?
Yeah, we were in Inchon quite a bit, and into Seoul, and one of our lieutenants was teaching English to Korean kids down in Inchon, and when he left, I took over his class for a while. Go down once a week, twice a week, I guess, and teach them. It was interesting. They didn't speak any English, and I didn't speak any Korean, but eventually they learned some English, and then they'd take me out for tea, or afterwards. And, these were teens and sub-teen boys, basically, who wanted to learn some English. And, apparently from higher level families, because they were school kids, and then I don't even know how he got it set up. Don't remember how he got the classes set up.
It wasn't an official Army business?
No, I don't think so. But I took it over from him for a while. And it was an interesting thing to do.
About the security of this battery?
Well, that was a problem because at that time in Korea, you had a tremendous criminal, call them slicky boys, but people were still, we're 10 or 15 years after the Korean War, and yet they're still scrapping to live. When I got there, they were still using human waste as fertilizer. There were ox carts everywhere. The primary means of transportation was walking, bicycle, ox carts, that kind of thing. The main road was what they called the main supply route, was a very narrow asphalt road, ran north to south, and all other roads off of it were dirt. So if the weather was bad, you had to really be careful, And one road we used to drive to get to Seoul, you had to ford a river. So it was interesting, and so it was very primitive at the time. The Koreans in some places had, in the city they had lights, they had electricity, but some of the places closer to the unit didn't. And of course they use this method of heating, which is compressed coal that's burned, and they have a trench that runs into the house, and the heat goes through the trench, so you have a lot of carbon monoxide deaths. Quite frankly, you could tell the horrible thing to say, but you could tell the severity of the winter by how many children survived in the village, how many little kids there were in the spring as opposed to in the fall. It was really tough living then.
You were in there for a year, then you left. Where did you go?
From there, I came back and went to school. Went to artillery advanced course at Fort Sill and Fort Bliss. Then I took command of a unit in Fort Bliss, battery, a couple different ones. And, that was a nice time. Whenever you're commanding a unit, it's busy, but it was a fun time.
Still basic anti-aircraft?
Yeah, same kind of unit, and that was from 65 to sometime in '67, I came out of command. I went to another unit as the logistics officer. It was a school support unit, Fort Bliss. And I hadn't been there very long. I got orders to Vietnam as an advisor.
Did you know, with the escalation of the war in Vietnam, that you were going to end up
Yeah,
going?
it's probably coming in. Yeah.
Did you have anxiety?
Yeah, sure. Everybody does. People were getting killed. And it built up. Fort Bliss had built up as a basic training, had a tremendous basic training group there, as well as everything else. It was primarily for air defense, but then because it's a large post, they had added a huge basic training element to take care of the need for basic training. Train people up for Vietnam, so they could take basic there and then go somewhere else for their advanced training. So, we had built up at Fort Bliss just like every other post had that was supporting the war one way or another.
You mentioned how you had anxiety going to Vietnam, but how about any time when you went to Korea? Was there a difference in the two?
Oh, going there was just more. The biggest problem was leaving my wife and small baby. We had one child then, and she was 2 years old. So leaving them was tough. But otherwise, it was kind of an adventure. I mean, we stopped in. At that time, when you went to Korea, you went to Japan by commercial flight, and then from Japan to Korea, you sat in Japan in Tokyo area until a military flight was going to Korea, and then you jumped on it. I ended up going on a Navy 4-engine prop job that you sat facing the rear. But we were in Tokyo for about 3 days, and I hooked up with an Army, as myself, a Navy lieutenant, and an Air Force lieutenant. We were all basically first lieutenants. And between us, we had enough money to take a tour of Tokyo, and they were gearing up for Olympics, so all tour bus people were, you could do it fairly cheaply, and they all wanted to practice their English on you. So we took a tour one day, and we went to whatever it's called, I don't remember now, the strip where all the nightclubs were, just to see what it was like. I couldn't afford to go in any of them because between us, we didn't have much money. We had to pool our money to do anything. And we went to, found a USO club or something that served really good food cheap. So we were able to get a decent meal. We were only there about 3 days, because that was good because we were going to run out of money real quick. We would have been just sitting around looking at four walls. But it was an adventure. And then by the time I left Korea, they had built a new airport, and you flew out of there by commercial jet to Tokyo, and then on to the States. So things had changed, and now it's completely different.
But going to Vietnam was going to be different.
Oh yeah.
Tell me about the day you got your.
Well, the day I got orders was actually, we were expecting them, so it wasn't. We knew it was coming, so it was just one of those things.
You say we, the whole unit?
No, my wife and I. We knew it was coming sooner or later. And basically, my concern was I'd just been in this job for a little bit of time, so I wanted to tell my commander, okay, I've got orders. Here's what I can do, and here's what needs to be done. Here's what I can do before I leave, and here's what I can get started, and here's who can finish what I can get started. Because there was a lot to do. Logistically, this unit was screwed up, and it needed a lot of work. So I said, this is it. This is all I can do. And I had about 60 days. And then I was to go to language training and on. And so he said, okay. So I did what I could, and we lined up a bunch of things. And then a few weeks later, I went off to, there was a Vietnamese language school also at the Defense Language Institute had a Vietnamese language school at Fort Bliss. And so I went there for, 60 or 90 days. It was a real short course to teach you basics. And then had some leave, and then in January left for Vietnam. Got there 2 weeks before the Tet Offensive in 1968.
In this school for language, was it like 8 hours long every day for those months?
Yeah. Every day, all day, and you took tapes home at night. They would issue the tape recorder, and you had, lots of tapes for every night. A lot of homework.
Were you able to speak relatively good Vietnamese by that time?
Yeah, you could understand some. But Vietnamese is a very difficult language. It's a tonal language. There are like, I think it's 7 different, for every vowel there are like 7 different tones, and it's not like ours. It's not like ah, a, that kind of thing. It's a tonal thing. And inflection can mean everything. I mean, you can say a word, and if your tone's wrong, you can really insult somebody. Or you can be saying something very simple. And so you have to really be careful. It was a verbal language that was written by a French priest. He's the one that put it on paper, and so he invented these signs for the various tones. And it's a very, I consider it a very difficult language to learn because of the tone thing.
When you left,
so it's kind of a sing-song thing to it.
When you left the United States, you left from Fort Bliss.
Yes.
And you flew to
San Francisco.
San Francisco. And from there,
basically, I suspect we stopped in Guam or someplace. I don't remember going.
Where'd you end up? Where in Vietnam?
Ended up in Saigon at Tan Son Nhut Airport.
And you got off the airplane and you looked around, and what were you supposed to do?
Scared. Well, what they did is they divided you up by whether you were Military Assistance Command or whether you're an American unit, and then all the Military Assistance Command people were put on a bus that had like chicken wire on the side so they couldn't throw a grenade through the window, and they did their best to scare you. And,
but here you are. You're a captain, aren't you?
Oh yeah, no, lieutenant. Well, no, I'm a captain then. That's right, I was a captain. Okay, so you're in khakis. You're not dressed for any of this, and they take you on this bus, and you end up in I don't know, someplace. I don't even remember where it was now. And you do a little processing, and okay, MACV, get on this bus, and away you go again, carrying everything you own with you. And they ended up putting us up in a hotel somewhere in Saigon. I don't even know where it was now, downtown Saigon somewhere, that was run by MACV. I do remember that I remember a James Bond book I read once, in which James Bond turns on the water spigot in a hotel, and out came a bug and some rusty old water, and that's exactly what happened in the shower in this hotel we were in. I don't know, there were a bunch of us, 3 or 4 in a room or whatever, and somebody went in, turned on the shower, and what he got was bugs and rusty water. He said, whoops, we have taken a step backward in civilization. And so then we went through this processing business of getting, jungle fatigues and weapons and all this other stuff.
Were you with people you knew?
No, not really. Only people, you met them as you, in the group processing, basically, or maybe a couple of them that you sat by on an airplane. In the military, you meet people quickly, and become acquainted quickly. A lot of acquaintances. Only a certain amount of close friends, but a lot of acquaintances. And say, you're all in the same experience, so you experience it together for that period of time. So we went through this business of getting clothes. There's always somebody around, an old tailor, who'd sew on insignia for you and things like that. And once you got all your gear, then you were waiting to go wherever you were going to go. Well, I was assigned to the 4 Corps, which was the southern, from Canto south, basically. So they put me on what was then called a caribou. It was a plane that was owned by the Army but was being transitioned for the Air Force to take over. So you'd have an Army guy and an Air Force guy flying. And a bunch of us were flown to Canto. And we met there, and we were taken to this place, which was the headquarters, and sat down in a chair, and the guy says, well, what do you want to do? I said, hey, they say I'm assigned here. Everybody's assigned to this, the Tactical Operations Center. Everybody's assigned there, and then we assign you to where there are jobs. And I said, well, here I am. Give me a job. So he says, well, here's a good one. He says, this guy just left, and he says, you kind of fit the criteria. I think I'll send you down here. He says, it's a good job. So they sent me to Bac Lieu Province as the S3 Air, the operations guy for air operations. And so that's where I was going. So they put me on another airplane and leave Canto and fly across all these rice paddies, and suddenly in those days when you landed in a spiral so that you were over the airport, and you landed like this, and you took off like this. And that was to reduce your exposure to ground fire. So here we come in this real tight spiral down. I couldn't see a landing field, and as they call PCP, this pierced armor plating stuff that they put down. They leveled out an area and put some of that down, and that's where you landed. Down we went, landed. They threw me out the back door with all my stuff and took off. I mean, I was standing in the middle of a rice paddy on this landing field. Nobody in sight. What am I doing here? And about that time, here comes a Jeep bouncing across. And throw your stuff in the back end. And I was there. So they took me back, and at that time we were living in, we had the senior advisor decided that we should live in the community. So although there was a compound of Americans who were advisors to a Vietnamese division, the team, the province team, lived outside that compound in the community. We had an old hotel, and we had an old, it was like a mansion, big old house. And then we had 2 or 3 trailers, maybe 4 trailers that had been, American type trailers that had been brought in. And all of us lived in one or another. I started off in the old hotel building, in a room there. And that's where I lived for about half of my tour. And,
what's the name of the town?
That was in Bac Lieu.
Bac Lieu?
Yeah. Bac Lieu or Vinh Loi. It's called both. Depends on the map you have. Bac Lieu is the Vietnamese name. One of them is the French name, and one of them is the Vietnamese name. I don't know which is which. But Vinhloi is the other way that it's known.
And did you stay in Vinh Loi or Bac Lieu?
Yeah, the whole time.
For the whole time?
Yeah, I was in the province advisory team. And at first, for most of the tour, I was the S3 Air, the operations for air. And that meant we did the planning for any bombing that was done by the Air Force in the province. We did the planning, actually did planning for what were called ranch hand missions, the defoliation. I had operational control over an Air Force guy who was a forward air controller. Had a little L-19, he flew around. And I had 2 Army pilots and their little Army L-19s who were reconnaissance pilots. So I had operational control over those 3 guys. And then by default, I owned a couple of spotlight units. There was a spotlight company that was scattered all over the Delta, and I had a spotlight and 4 or 5 guys that were enlisted guys that ran that spotlight, and their job was to go out and light up areas like around bridges, key bridges, or the airfield at night. They would just randomly run their spot, and that was to I guess, illuminate if any bad guys were trying to sneak in. It was kind of a way to keep them off their, keep the bad guys kind of shook up so they wouldn't come in.
Can you tell me what happened? You're two weeks in Vietnam, and then the big attack comes.
Yeah, well, I was there, and I've described it before as multiple wars. When I first got there, it was down there. It was a laid-back thing. You never knew when the Vietnamese were going to do something. You'd have 5 minutes notice that they were going on operation, and you were supposed to be with them. And it was...
You mean the South Vietnamese Army?
Yeah. Well, it's actually the province guys who had some troops under their control. And they would, we go now. Okay, and you'd have to throw everything together and go. And it was very disorganized and, like I said, laid back. And so we went on a few of those operations, and they were trying to get me into it. So I always went with this major. And then one day they wanted to go on. There was an airlift operation, and so we get on a helicopter, and we're airlifted way out in the province and set down by this village. And there's this major, myself, our radio operator, and 2 or 3 Vietnamese, and we set up and looking around, and we're it. And then make a couple radio calls, and then they come with Chinooks and drop off a company that provides our security after we've been there for half an hour. I learned then that the American helicopters, the Chinooks, didn't come in unless there were Americans on the ground, and I was one of the Americans on the ground. So they put us in. If we didn't get shot, then they bring in the Chinooks with our security. So that was my introduction to this. And of course, when the Chinooks first came in, they pointed at helmets, and everybody put their helmet on. And I'm looking at them, and put your helmet on. So I did. Well, the Chinook has a tremendous prop wash, and this little village had a corrugated tin roof. And when the helicopter landed, all the roof flew off. And they wanted you to have your helmet on in case the roof fell on your head. So, I learned a lot of practical things very quickly that day. And then as dusk came and we're getting out of there, the last helicopter in took us and our security out. And that was kind of scary because at that time, you really didn't go anywhere at night. And there were places you just didn't stay at night. The Viet Cong owned the night, and we owned the day. That's what it was like. Well, then 2 weeks into this thing, it's Tet. And so at Tet, there's all kinds of fireworks and celebration and so forth. And I got up this one morning, I'm going to the operations center where I worked all day. And I hear all this stuff that's not fireworks, and people running in all different directions. So I find out that the divisional compound has been attacked, and fortunately they attacked where the artillery unit was, and the artillery unit was our strongest Vietnamese unit there in the area, and they repelled this attack. Then the attackers were coming in. They were to come in and assassinate the hierarchy of this Vietnamese division that was headquartered there. Well, they were beat off by the artillery guys, and so I was on a radio, and I commandeered the division senior advisor, this full colonel's helicopter, and we loaded it up with some Vietnamese soldiers and some Americans, and they went off because our unit to would be the west, the westernmost district was under tremendous attack, just big attack, and they needed help. Well, the only thing
there was so much going on all over the country then when we finally figured out what was happening that we couldn't get any air support. So our full air support were guys hanging out of his helicopter, flying in and shooting, and then eventually my Army guys had rockets attached to their wings, and they got up and flew out and were shooting rockets at the bad guys and broke up this attack and saved our team and the people and the Vietnamese guys in this district out there. But they blew all the bridges, so we couldn't go anywhere. No food was coming in. You couldn't get up and down the roads because there weren't any bridges. And so that was one of the things they did that night, was blow all the bridges. So that first day was spent repelling this attack and trying to support our units with what little we had. And then that night, I guess it was probably a full company of Viet Cong attacked the city. And one platoon had come across a graveyard by the airport, and our spotlight guys found him and pinned him down. And this is a bunch of little low-ranking enlisted men who, with their spotlight and a couple of machine guns, kept these guys pinned down. And we called in a thing called Spooky, which they still use. It's a C-130 with a 105 cannon and a whole bunch of guns, rotating barrel guns and Gatling type guns. And the next day, that entire platoon of the Viet Cong are in that cemetery dead. So we wiped them out. Another platoon came into the city about where we just a block or two from where we lived, and repelled them, and they kind of dissipated, and except they left a few snipers in a building there that were interesting for a few days. And they during their retreat, they set fire to the city. There was a canal ran through close to where we lived, and everything on the far side of the canal was destroyed. It was a horrible thing. People and animals and everything else floating in that canal for weeks afterwards. It burned down half the city. It was really, really bad. The other half of the city escaped that. And basically, most of those people were run down and eliminated. And then we had sniper problems for a couple of days. And
how did you take care of the sniper?
Well, they were holed up in a building, and they kept shooting at us. And I had gone up to the roof of the building I lived in, which was this old hotel. And at the top, there was like a little shed affair when you first came up the stairs. And I was just ready to step out of that when I looked out, and the province senior advisor was standing here, and the province chief was standing here, and the guy between them got shot, dropped dead right there. Of course, everybody hit the ground. I went back down the steps, and it was these sniper guys, and so they called in gunships. Finally got some gunships down there, and they basically started blowing. They blew this building apart and got the snipers. And once those snipers were eliminated, that was the end of any problem in the city. And then the district and the troops in the district teams, and then working out of Bac Lieu with divisional troops, we just kept spreading out. We were going out and repairing bridges on the main road. And as you'd repair a bridge, you could get, hook up with more people. We finally repaired the last bridge, which hooked us up with this district that had been under attack in the western area. And a couple of my pilots were heroes in that. As these guys were coming to meet us, they were attacked by a company at BC, and our pilots shooting rockets in and kind of decimated this group and caused them to retreat. But at the end of a couple of weeks, this Tet Offensive thing, the Viet Cong really didn't exist anymore. They were wiped out, and that's what was never figured out back here. Back here was a great defeat for the Americans. Well, the defeat was one of intelligence, but not militarily. There was really, as far as I could tell, no Viet Cong presence after that. Yes, there were some political ones, but militarily, the Viet Cong were pretty much done. And I was in the province further west, the furthest west, called Kamau, which is the end of the Kamau Peninsula, western edge of Vietnam, was really hit hard. And those people, I've seen photographs of the bodies stacked high at every intersection in that city. They came in through the sewers and everything else. And they were completely wiped out. There were no VC down there. After that, it was a war with the North Vietnamese.
How did you feel when you saw your first dead VC?
I gotta say, I really didn't feel much. It was, okay.
How about dead Vietnamese?
Well, we were fortunate. We had very few casualties. Very few. And American-wise, we had a couple of humorous ones. People shot in the posterior, basically because they were flying. That's when we all learned to take two flak jackets. You wore one, you sat on one. Because L-19s and helicopters were not heavily armored. So you sat on one flak jacket and you wore the other when you were flying.
You did too?
Oh, yeah.
Did you ever come close to getting hit?
I've been shot at in airplanes. I've been shot at on the ground, yeah. Well, probably the closest I ever came was in a place I didn't ever expect it. When these snipers were still in the city. We were in a compound. We had a building on one side of this little compound, a building on the other, and probably 50 feet between the two buildings. And I was in one, and where it was like an office, and the other one was where we had all our radios and things. It's the operational area. And I started to walk from one to the other, and 2 rounds were close enough that I knew they were there. You can't describe, you can only experience a close call with a bullet. It's the bullet breaking sound barrier as it goes by you. You know it's close. Fortunately, if you know it's close, it didn't hit you. It was 2 rounds, and shot by one of these snipers. And I don't know how he missed me, but he did.
During Tet.
Yeah, this was like the day after this big, when the first day and night was the biggie, and this was the next day. And I'm walking from one building to another, and these 2 rounds. They don't know if they were going this way or this way, but they were close enough that I felt them, so to speak.
Did you hit the ground?
I went back in the building awfully quick, yeah.
Running?
Diving, might say. And I didn't have my helmet on, but I walked back out of that building with my helmet on.
When you went between these buildings during that time, the day after, well, the day you got shot at, did you walk between or did you run?
Well, at that time I was walking because there was no indication of any problem. We knew these snipers were in this one building, but they were in a place where they couldn't see that compound I was in. And this guy was in a different building. Well, then we knew he was there, so we sent some people out and they got him. But, you know, up until then, we didn't know anybody was that deep into that they could even see that compound. And they were probably set there in order to try and get the Prov Street because his house was part of that compound. And we didn't know that they could even see the compound.
Were you conversing with the province chief a lot in Vietnamese?
I spent, no, well, he spoke pretty good English. I spoke a little bit of Vietnamese. Mostly it was English.
Right.
Yeah, he spoke pretty good English. And eventually, for some reason, he and I struck a great rapport. And although my superior would ordinarily have gone with him because we had a rapport, I went with him off. And he would be the operational commander of his soldiers out in the field because he was a lieutenant colonel in the Army and a province chief. So whenever there was an operation, he'd be out in an operations center, set up on a road somewhere, running the thing. Because I had a rapport. They wanted me to be with him because he'd listened to me, I guess, and asked for advice and assistance. And he and I just got along really well. I'm not sure why. He trusted me for some reason. And so I was with him a lot. Now, at the beginning, we had a little unit there that went out on operations. We didn't have anybody advising it. And so a lieutenant that worked for me and myself, the two of us would alternate going with them. And that's how I ended up with kind of infantryman badges. We were in a few firefights with that group. And I don't know, probably 3 months, every other day I was out with that group. Then after that is when I started going with Province Chief all the time. And I was with him a great deal of time. And then we started doing helicopter operations with, they called the regional forces and the popular forces, which were RFPF, which were the local National Guard guys, I guess. And we started doing helicopter operations with these people, and to my knowledge, nobody had ever done that before. And we, our district guys would train their guys how to get on helicopters and all that. And most of these guys never ridden on a helicopter. First time they got on a helicopter, they were going into a operation and never been on a helicopter before. So they had to train them on what to do without ever practicing. First time they got on a helicopter, that was their first practice. First time they got off one was their first practice. And so we started doing these operations, and they were going pretty good. We found a huge cache of weapons in the swamp area down there, and pulled a bunch of them out and destroyed in place tremendously. They piled them all up in a big heap and set a fire and brought in the Air Force and blew them all up. But so what we found out is a weapons manufacturing place. They were manufacturing a .45 caliber pistol that looked like ours, but it had a VC emblem on it.
You mentioned you went out on a firefight with a combat infantry platoon. This platoon made up of Vietnamese?
Yeah, we were advisors for them. Whenever they went out, you had to have an American with them because if they needed air support or artillery support, we'd talk to the advisors of the artillery or to the Americans flying the airplanes.
And it was just one American?
Usually two, officer and a radio guy. Occasionally more. And if you were training somebody, like first time I went out with somebody else who'd been there longer. First time my lieutenant went out, he went out with me. And we always had a radio operator. Because that was our really main job was communication with the Americans who were supporting.
The people you went out with were different oftentimes, or did you get...
No, you mean the Vietnamese?
Both.
The Vietnamese was this group of regional forces, and they were always the same. It was an RF company, I think, or a PF company that was organized in the province headquarters, and they just didn't have an advisor at first. Eventually, we got an advisory team whose job was to train and be with these guys all the time. But until that team came in and became part of our overall province team with a specific mission to work with these guys, then somebody had to be with them for American support and to coordinate. So we took over the job.
The Vietnamese soldiers in this militia, were they experts, or did you consider it?
No, they did okay. They did okay. They were
they weren't
better
balls. They weren't goofballs.
No. They were better after we got the advisory team with them full time, because we didn't work with them except when they were in the field, because we had other jobs to do. But once we had a full-time advisory team, then they started a training program that got them more professional.
Can you
But
describe?
they weren't guys that ran when the shots started or anything like that. We had some pretty good firefights with them.
Can you describe one of those firefights that happened?
It's the usual kind of stuff down there in the Delta, where depending on where you were, this is in mangrove swamps and things, where you really don't see much except bullets start flying and you start returning them. And it may be 30 seconds or 2 minutes of intense fire, and then they retreat, or you know, in most cases, it was somebody shooting at you and then they'd disappear, retreat. As soon as you return fire, they'd go away.
Did you shoot M16?
No, we were carrying carbines at the time.
But you did shoot.
Yeah. And you never knew whether you were hitting anybody. Right? Because this volume of fire coming in both directions. But we were fortunate; we never lost anybody or anything like that. So.
No.
Any of the ones I was in, no. And the VC always took their wounded. So unless you saw a blood trail or something, you didn't know whether you shot anybody, whether you got anybody or not. The only time you saw bodies is when you were in the only time we saw bodies was when there had been some other kind of, a bombing run, and you were sweeping in behind it for damage assessment, or you were involved in some kind of a sweep where some unit was in front of you, because we were always in the headquarters. We weren't, except when I was out with this unit, which was the first 2 or 3 months, I was always with the headquarters. And you were more concerned with a roadside bomb or something, kind of like these guys in Iraq are.
Did you come across roadside bombs?
All the time. Homemade stuff. I know exactly what they're talking about. You get a bunch of C4 and you put rocks and nails and glass and stuff in it, and you fix it up so it's aimed at, and some guy sitting off under a tree waits for a truck to drive by and says it on. It used to happen all the time. And all the Jeeps had a arm that was shaped like this, that was welded onto the front bumper to catch tripwires, so that it would be out in front and you could catch a tripwire, especially if you were driving through a jungle or something. Catch an overhead tripwire and it would set it off before you got there. So, but there were mines. I've been in convoys when somebody in front of me or behind me was blown up, hitting a mine. Nobody hurt. We were lucky. We very rarely lost anybody. It's not that we didn't lose some of our Vietnamese soldiers, but it was very rare. A lot of the stuff down there were unexploded ordnance from bombings that they would pick up and convert into an IED, as they call them now, improvised explosive device. Bomblets, CBU bomblets, which is a type of bomb that the Air Force dropped at that time. They picked those things up, and quite frequently they'd be messing with them, and you'd come on 3 or 4 dead Vietnamese with the remains of one of these, because they didn't know what they were doing. And, trying to set something up, they'd blow themselves up. That happened a lot.
Did you see many children who were wounded?
Not where I was. Don't recall ever seeing any.
Did you write your wife much?
Tried to, frequently, and for the first few months I was sending her tapes, sit down every once in a while over 2 or 3 days and make a tape of some kind and send it to them, and they'd send me tapes. And then I came back one day from an operation, and they said, "You better go to your quarters because there's been a fire." I said, "Oh, great." We had these standalone closet things where our clothes were, and you had a light bulb in there to try and keep it dry. You always unplugged it when you left in the morning because you didn't want to leave it. And I know I unplugged it. May probably plugged it back in. Somehow I overheated and exploded and started to fire. Unfortunately, there was an extra weapon and a whole bunch of ammunition under the bed. So they weren't real sure about fighting that fire because they knew everybody had weapons and ammunition in their rooms, especially after Tet. And so they were really not too keen on going in and fighting this fire. It pretty much burned up all my clothes and equipment, melted my little tape recorder, and pretty much everything. She had just sent me a beautiful oil painting of oil colored picture of her and my daughter, and that was destroyed in this fire. Pretty much everything. So I ended up going to Saigon and getting a whole new issue of clothes and equipment, starting over again. I had this pistol that I turned in that was all scorched and burned. Traded it in for a carbine.
The big shows that were put on by entertainers during Vietnam, did they ever come and see
where I was? And none of them got to me down there. They had before I got there. Martha Ray had gotten down there one time and had, signed the wall. Her autograph was on the wall. And she must have been doing like one of these one-man things, hopping all over the place, but not while I was there. The only time I saw anything like that, I saw Bob Hope show when I was in Korea. A very good show. Lots of troops.
Was this after or before Vietnam?
Well, it was when I was there.
In 50.
So it was kind of at the beginning. And he used to, he went all over the world. So it was his year to come to Korea, and he was there. And, that was a tremendous show.
Well, you were in this Bac Lieu Province for the entire year. You lived in a hotel for nearly half the time.
Yeah, and then after the fire, I moved over into this house that the rest of the team lived in. Shared a room with one of the other guys in this big old mansion. We also used that as a dining area, a big dining room downstairs we used, where we showed movies.
Did the camp ever come back under attack at all during the rest of the year?
Every once in a while. We're sitting there watching a movie one night. A couple mortar rounds come in. Blew up a Jeep. Kind of stopped the movie for a while until we figured out what was going on. And then we started the movie back up. But every once in a while something like that would happen. But like I said, once Tet was over, because we were mostly concerned with Viet Cong down there weren't any left. They were going into villages and grabbing sub-teen kids out of bed and forcing them to be soldiers by the time Tet was over. And there just weren't any soldiers left down there. And the North Vietnamese Army was not down where I was. They weren't that far south. And they were busy up north. So everything down there was Viet Cong, and we kept expanding. We were going places. When I left there, we were going places where no government official had been in 50 years. I drove from the province headquarters to our easternmost district one day along the coast road. Province chief was all shook up that I did it, but it was a road that when I first got there, you just did not drive, ever. And we drove the whole road.
Why?
Because you'd be attacked. You would be attacked any time you drove that road. Well, we weren't attacked. And the reason we went out there was that as that district began to push out and take more and more control of their district, rather than just the town, they found an ethnic Chinese village that the government didn't even know was there. And so we were asking these people, well, what do you need? Well, what they wanted was a school teacher that spoke Chinese and Vietnamese. That was their only request. They've been isolated out there by themselves for who knows how many years. And their only request was for a school teacher that spoke Chinese and Vietnamese. So, and we were this was happening everywhere. We were opening canals that hadn't been opened in years and years and years. And it was open so you could travel on them. Our northernmost district, there were many canals that converged there, but they were all blocked, or otherwise you couldn't travel.
Because of the war?
Yeah. The Vietnamese had blocked them. The Viet Cong had blocked them off, or if you traveled them, you were subject to being shot, ambushed from the shore. And the blockages were starting to be cleared, and people were traveling the canals, which meant commerce was starting again. So all these good things were happening when I left. The last thing I did was write a plan for basically for getting out of there, which was what needs to be done to get these people completely on their feet from an engineering aspect and nation building aspect. And I wrote on legal yellow paper about 30 pages of what had to be done and handed it over as I left. And I honestly expected to go back there as a tourist, because I figured the war was over when I left. I get back home and find out that we lost the war. Oh, that's interesting. I was there. Now, I personally never ran into the kind of abuse that a lot of Vietnam veterans did when I came back. I was never spit on or cursed or anything like that. I never ran into that. But it's probably where I was. I just wasn't in a place where that occurred. When I came back, I was assigned Colorado Springs, which is back in the Nike business. But at Colorado Springs area was pretty much pro-military with Fort Carson and NORAD and Army Air Defense Command and all that around there. And I just never ran into it. The only thing we had then was Jane Fonda came to visit out there.
How was your opinion toward her at the time?
It hasn't changed. She's a traitor. I had no use for her, period. Didn't like her then, don't like her now. Won't go to her movies. She's a pretty good actress, but I won't go to her movies. Why should I put money in her pocket? And she really made a fool of herself when she came to Colorado Springs, because she thought she was going to find something terrible in Fort Carson. They knew she was coming, and she was followed everywhere. And people knew where she was at all times. And she thought she was going to waltz in there and find something wrong with the I hate the word prison. That's the word I want. Anyway, confinement facility. She thought she was going to find a bunch of soldiers that were in rebellion and all this kind of stuff, and she found none of that. So she went away quietly, and there wasn't a real big splash in the newspapers because she didn't find anything to splash.
Did you ever decide if you wanted to go back as another tour?
I would have. I didn't volunteer, but I would have. But I was caught up in the system, which sent me from there to school again. And by the time I got out of school, things were winding down. I went from there to Fort Leavenworth Banjo and Staff College, which was, I was in one of the larger classes. There were almost 1,500 of us. And we had people from all over the world in there, in addition to the military, to the American military. And most of the American military, in fact, I think all of us were veterans of Vietnam. In fact, my yearbook has all of the number of medals awarded. And it's unbelievable how many. And of the people that were in that class.
You became a full colonel before you retired in '89. outfit were you with when you were full colonel?
Well, I was promoted to full colonel when I was Inspector General, Department of the Army Inspector General. And the last 6.5 years, I was involved in the Army chemical and nuclear programs. And 3.5 years as an Inspector General, surety of nuclear and chemical weapons. In other words, ensuring that they were secured and that there was no possibility of accidents and that kind of thing. And then the last 3 years, I was in the Army operations as the policy guy for nuclear and chemical surety. Again, writing the regulations and that kind of thing.
Well, thank you very much for your interview. Is there any final words you'd like to have? We're right almost done.
Don't think so. I spent basically 34 years in uniform. I enjoyed every minute of it. I'd do it again.
Thank you, Colonel Larue.